The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Kensington Palace as 10-year-old Prince George walked slowly toward the main building. His small shoulders were hunched forward, and his usually bright eyes seemed clouded with something that looked far too heavy for a child his age to carry. The young prince had always been known for his cheerful demeanor and curious nature, but today something was different. Something had changed. George had spent the previous evening at a formal dinner event where members of the royal family gathered with close friends and advisors. These events were typically filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of warmth that made the palace feel more like a home than an institution. But last night had been different. Last night, something had happened that left the young prince feeling confused, hurt, and strangely alone. As he made his way through the ornate hallways, George's mind kept returning to the conversation he had overheard. He hadn't meant to listen in, but sometimes when adults think children aren't paying attention, they say things they probably shouldn't. The voices had come from the drawing room, where Queen Camilla was entertaining some of her closest friends and advisors. George had been looking for his father, Prince William, when he heard his own name mentioned in a tone that made him stop and hide behind the heavy curtains. "The boy is too sensitive for this life," one of the women had said with a dismissive laugh. "He needs to toughen up if he's ever going to be fit to rule. All this coddling from Catherine and William isn't doing him any favors." Another voice, one that George recognized as belonging to Lady Margaret Thornfield, a longtime friend of Camilla's, had chimed in. "Children these days are so fragile. In our time, we knew how to prepare children for responsibility. This generation of royals is raising their children like common citizens, not future monarchs." But it was Camilla's response that had cut the deepest. George shows promise, but he lacks the steel that true leaders need. Perhaps it's time someone taught him what real strength looks like, rather than all this modern parenting nonsense about feelings and emotional intelligence. The words had hit George like physical blows. He had always tried so hard to be good, to make his parents proud, to live up to what everyone expected of him. He studied hard, participated in royal duties appropriate for his age, and always tried to be kind to everyone he met. But according to these women, none of that mattered. According to them, he was weak, too soft, not fit for the role he would one day inherit. George had slipped away from the drawing room without being seen, but the damage was done. The words echoed in his mind as he tried to fall asleep that night, and they were still there when he woke up this morning. He felt a strange mixture of anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. It felt like shame, though he wasn't sure what he had to be ashamed of. As he continued down the hallway, George didn't notice the figure watching him from a doorway. Sergeant Major James Harrison had been part of the Royal Protection Detail for over 15 years, and in that time he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the moods and needs of the family members he was sworn to protect. James was a tall, imposing man with kind eyes and a gentle manner that contrasted sharply with his military bearing. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining the royal household, and he understood better than most what it meant to carry burdens that felt too heavy for one person to bear. James had noticed the change in George's demeanor immediately. The boy's usual confident stride had been replaced by a hesitant shuffle. His head, which typically turned this way, and that as he took in everything around him with natural curiosity, was now fixed firmly on the ground. Something was clearly troubling the young prince, and James's protective instincts were immediately on high alert. Over the years, James had developed special relationships with all the younger members of the royal family. He wasn't just their bodyguard. He was often their confidant, their source of comfort during difficult times, and sometimes the adult who understood them best when the pressures of royal life became overwhelming. With George, this relationship had been particularly strong. The boy was intelligent beyond his years, but still carried the natural vulnerability of childhood, and James had often found himself serving as a bridge between George's royal duties and his need to simply be a child. James stepped out of the doorway and began walking alongside George, matching the boy's slower pace. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. James had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing an adult could do for a troubled child was simply to be present, to offer their company without demanding explanations or trying to fix everything immediately. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Your Highness?" James said eventually, his voice carrying the warm, respectful tone he always used with the children. George glanced up briefly, managed a weak smile, and nodded. "Yes, Sergeant Major Harrison, it is." But James could see that George's heart wasn't in the response. The boy's voice lacked its usual energy, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he was fighting back tears. James had seen this look before, in young soldiers who had experienced their first real taste of the cruelty that existed in the world. It was the look of someone whose innocence had been damaged, not destroyed, but definitely wounded. "You know," James continued, keeping his tone light and conversational, "I was thinking about taking a walk through the gardens this morning. The roses are particularly beautiful this time of year. Would you care to join me? I find that gardens have a way of making even the most complicated problems seem a bit more manageable." George looked up at James with surprise. The sergeant major was always kind to him, but this invitation felt different somehow. It felt like James was offering him something more than just a walk. It felt like he was offering him a safe space, a chance to talk about whatever was troubling him without judgment or pressure. "I would like that," George said quietly. "Thank you." As they made their way toward the gardens, James couldn't help but notice how small George looked. Despite being tall for his age, despite the confident way he usually carried himself, today he seemed fragile and vulnerable. It reminded James of his own childhood, growing up in a working-class family where showing emotion was often seen as weakness. He had learned the hard way that there was actually tremendous strength in allowing yourself to feel, in admitting when something had hurt you, and in seeking support when you needed it. The palace gardens were indeed spectacular that morning. The roses were in full bloom, their colors ranging from deep crimson to pale pink to pure white. They needed to feel safe, to know that they could trust the person they were talking to, and to believe that their feelings would be taken seriously. George was no exception to this rule, despite his royal status and the unique pressures that came with it. "Sergeant Major Harrison," George said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you think I'm weak?" The question hit James like a punch to the gut. In all his years of protecting the royal family, through all the conversations he had had with George, he had never heard the boy express doubt about his own character in such a direct way. Someone had clearly said something to make George question himself, and James felt a surge of protective anger toward whoever had planted this seed of self-doubt in the child's mind. "Weak," James repeated, turning to look directly at George. "Your Highness, in all my years of knowing you, weakness is the last word I would ever use to describe you. What makes you ask such a question?" George's lower lip trembled slightly, and James could see that the boy was fighting hard to maintain his composure. "I heard some people talking last night. They said I was too sensitive, that I needed to toughen up if I was ever going to be a proper king. They said I was being coddled, and that I lacked the strength that real leaders need." James felt his jaw clench involuntarily. He had suspected that George's distress was related to something he had heard, but knowing it for certain made his protective instincts flare even stronger. How dare anyone make a child feel inadequate for having emotions, for being kind and thoughtful? How dare anyone suggest that sensitivity was a weakness rather than one of the greatest strengths a leader could possess? "George," James said, his voice gentle but firm, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. The people who said those things to you don't understand what real strength looks like. They're confusing hardness with strength, and they're confusing emotional intelligence with weakness. Those are very different things." George looked up at James with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "But what if they're right? What if I'm too soft for this job? What if I can't handle being king because I care too much about people's feelings?" James was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He knew that his next words could have a profound impact on how George saw himself, not just today, but for years to come. This was one of those pivotal moments when the right guidance could help shape a child's understanding of their own worth and potential. "Let me tell you a story," James said finally. "When I was serving in Afghanistan, I had a commanding officer named Colonel Sarah Mitchell. She was one of the toughest, most respected leaders I ever served under. But do you know what made her so effective as a leader?" George shook his head, his attention completely focused on James now. "It wasn't because she was hard or cold or unfeeling," James continued. "It was because she cared deeply about every single person under her command. She knew their names, their families, their fears, and hopes. When she had to make difficult decisions, she always considered how those decisions would affect the people she was responsible for. Some people called her soft because she showed emotion when soldiers were hurt or killed. But her soldiers would have followed her anywhere because they knew she genuinely cared about them." James paused, watching as George processed this information. "That's what real leadership looks like, Your Highness. It's not about being tough or unfeeling. It's about caring so deeply about the people you're responsible for that you're willing to make hard choices for their benefit, even when those choices hurt your own heart." George was quiet for a long moment, considering James's words. But the ladies last night made it sound like caring was a bad thing, like it would make me a weak king. "Those ladies," James said, choosing his words carefully, "grew up in a different time when people believed that showing emotion was always a sign of weakness. But the world has changed, and we've learned that the best leaders are the ones who can understand and connect with the people they serve. Your sensitivity isn't a weakness, George. It's your superpower." The phrase made George smile slightly, the first genuine smile James had seen from him all morning. "My superpower? Absolutely," James confirmed. "Think about the great leaders throughout history that people still admire and respect today. They weren't the ones who ruled through fear or intimidation. They were the ones who inspired people, who made others feel seen and valued and understood. That kind of leadership requires enormous emotional strength, not emotional weakness." As they continued to talk, James could see the tension in George's shoulders beginning to ease. The boy was still processing what had happened the night before, but he was starting to see it in a different light. Instead of accepting the criticism as truth, he was beginning to understand that different people had different ideas about what strength looked like, and that the people who had hurt his feelings might not have the best understanding of effective leadership. "Sergeant Major Harrison," George said after a while, "do you think my parents are raising me the wrong way?" The lady said that all this modern parenting about feelings and emotional intelligence wasn't helping prepare me for being king. James felt another surge of anger toward the women who had so carelessly wounded this child's confidence. "Your parents," he said firmly, "are raising you to be exactly the kind of leader this country needs. They're teaching you to think about other people, to consider different perspectives, and to make decisions based on compassion as well as logic. Those are the qualities that will make you a truly great king someday." The conversation continued for another hour as James patiently helped George work through his confusion and hurt. By the time they rose from the bench to head back to the palace, George was standing a little straighter, his natural confidence beginning to return. But James knew that this was just the beginning. The damage done by thoughtless words couldn't be completely healed in a single conversation, no matter how caring and insightful that conversation might be. As they walked back through the gardens, George looked up at James with an expression of gratitude and trust that made the older man's heart swell with protective affection. "Thank you for talking with me today. I was feeling really confused and hurt, and you helped me understand things better." "That's what I'm here for, Your Highness," James replied. "Not just to keep you safe from physical harm, but to help you navigate the emotional challenges that come with your position. You never have to face difficult feelings alone." But even as he spoke these comforting words, James was already planning his next steps. George's immediate distress had been addressed, but the underlying problem remained. Someone in Camilla's circle had thoughtlessly wounded a child, and James wasn't about to let that slide. His protective instincts were fully activated now, and he was determined to ensure that George never had to endure that kind of emotional attack again. The young prince deserved better than having his confidence undermined by adults who should have known better, and James was going to make sure he got it. The following morning, Sergeant Major James Harrison arrived at the palace earlier than usual. The conversation with Prince George had stayed with him throughout the previous evening, and he had spent considerable time thinking about how to address the situation that had caused the young prince such distress. James was a man of action, someone who believed that problems were meant to be solved rather than simply endured. And, in his mind, adults who carelessly wounded children with their thoughtless words represented a problem that needed immediate attention. James had always taken his role as protector of the royal family seriously, but his relationship with the younger generation went far beyond professional duty. Over the years, he had watched Prince George grow from a curious toddler into a thoughtful, intelligent young boy who showed every sign of becoming the kind of leader the country could be proud of. To see that natural confidence shaken by adults who should have known better had stirred something deep and protective in James's chest. As he made his rounds that morning, James found himself paying particular attention to the movements and schedules of Queen Camilla and her circle of friends. He had learned long ago that understanding the patterns and behaviors of everyone in the palace was crucial to his effectiveness as a protector. Today, that knowledge was going to serve a different purpose than usual. Lady Margaret Thornfield, one of the women whose voice George had recognized from the previous night's conversation, was scheduled to join Camilla for afternoon tea in the palace's small drawing room. James knew that this would likely be the perfect opportunity to observe the group's dynamics and possibly overhear more of the kind of conversation that had so deeply hurt George. He wasn't planning to eavesdrop exactly, but he was definitely planning to position himself where he could monitor the situation. Around mid-morning, James encountered Prince William in one of the palace corridors. The future king was reviewing some official documents as he walked, but he looked up with a friendly smile when he saw James approaching. "Good morning, Sergeant Major," William said warmly. "I trust all is well this morning." James hesitated for a moment. In all his years of service, he had always maintained strict professional boundaries. He protected the family's privacy fiercely, and he never involved himself in their personal affairs unless specifically asked or unless he perceived a direct threat to their safety. But George's distress had been so genuine, so deeply felt, that James felt compelled to at least hint at what had happened. "Your Highness," James said carefully, "I wonder if I might have a word with you about Prince George when you have a few free minutes today." William's expression immediately shifted to one of concern. As a father, he was attuned to any suggestion that one of his children might be struggling with something. "Is everything all right? Has something happened?" "Nothing dangerous, sir," James assured him quickly. "But the young prince seemed rather troubled yesterday morning, and I thought you should be aware that he's been dealing with some emotional challenges lately." William studied James's face, recognizing the careful way the sergeant major was choosing his words. William had learned to read between the lines when his security team was trying to tell him something without overstepping their professional boundaries. "I see," William said thoughtfully. "Would you say this is something that requires immediate parental attention, or something that might resolve itself with time and support?" James considered his response carefully. "I believe Prince George would benefit from knowing that his parents are aware he's been struggling, sir. Sometimes children carry burdens they don't need to carry alone, especially when those burdens involve questions about their own worth and capabilities." William's eyebrows rose slightly at this last comment. James's words suggested that George had been made to feel inadequate in some way, which immediately set off alarm bells in the father's mind. "I'll make sure to have a conversation with George today," William said firmly. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Sergeant Major." After William departed, James continued with his duties, but his mind remained focused on the afternoon tea gathering. He had served in enough complex situations to know that sometimes the best way to address a problem was to gather more information before taking direct action. He needed to understand exactly what kind of attitudes and beliefs were being expressed in Camilla's social circle before he could determine the best way to protect George from further emotional harm. As the afternoon approached, James positioned himself in a location where he could observe the comings and goings around the drawing room without being obvious about it. Lady Margaret Thornfield arrived precisely on time, accompanied by two other women whom James recognized as regular members of Camilla's inner circle. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell was a longtime friend from Camilla's pre-royal days, and Countess Victoria Pembroke was a distant relative who had become something of a constant companion to the Queen Consort. James watched as the women settled into the drawing room, their voices already animated with conversation and laughter. From his position, he could hear the general tone of their discussion, but not the specific words. However, it didn't take long for their voices to rise enough that he could make out some of what they were saying. The problem with this younger generation of royals, Lady Margaret was saying in the same dismissive tone that had so hurt George the previous evening, is that they've forgotten that monarchy is about strength and authority, not about being everyone's friend. Exactly, agreed Mrs. Hartwell. All this nonsense about emotional intelligence and sensitivity is fine for ordinary children, but royal children need to be prepared for a different kind of life. They need to understand that their feelings are secondary to their duties. James felt his jaw clench as he listened to these women casually dismiss the value of the very qualities that made George such a special child. They were talking about a 10-year-old boy as if he were a political problem to be solved rather than a human being with thoughts, feelings, and a natural need for understanding and support. Camilla's voice joined the conversation, and James strained to hear her words clearly. I do worry sometimes that William and Catherine are too protective of the children. Royal life requires a certain toughness that can only be developed through experience. Perhaps it's time someone provided the children with a more realistic perspective on what their future roles will require. The implications of this statement sent a chill down James's spine. It sounded very much like Camilla, and her friends were considering taking it upon themselves to toughen up the royal children, possibly without their parents' knowledge or consent. The idea of these women subjecting George, or his siblings Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, to their particular brand of character building made James's protective instincts flare with unprecedented intensity. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation in the drawing room continued along similar lines. The women discussed various ways they believed the royal children were being coddled and speculated about how they might be better prepared for their future responsibilities. Throughout it all, there was a complete lack of understanding of child development, emotional health, or the kind of leadership skills that were actually valued in the modern world. James had heard enough. He quietly retreated from his observation post and spent the rest of the afternoon developing a plan of action. He couldn't directly confront Camilla or her friends without overstepping his professional boundaries, but he could certainly ensure that the right people were made aware of the situation. More importantly, he could make sure that George and his siblings were better protected from this kind of emotional undermining in the future. That evening, James requested a private meeting with Prince William. Such meetings were not uncommon. As head of security for the royal family, James regularly briefed William on various matters related to safety and protection protocols. However, this particular meeting was going to cover territory that was more personal than professional. William received James in his private study, a comfortable room lined with books and family photographs that felt more like a home office than a formal royal receiving room. William gestured for James to take a seat in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, creating an atmosphere that encouraged honest conversation. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me this evening, Your Highness," James began. "As I mentioned this morning, I have some concerns about Prince George that I believe you should be aware of." William leaned forward slightly, his expression serious and attentive. "Please, tell me what's troubling him." James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would likely have significant consequences for several people. "Yesterday morning, I found Prince George in considerable emotional distress. After some gentle questioning, He revealed that he had overheard a conversation the previous evening in which several adults criticized his character and questioned his fitness for his future role as king. William's face darkened with anger. What exactly did these people say to him? They didn't say anything directly to him, sir, James clarified. Prince George overheard them talking about him when they didn't realize he was listening. According to what he told me, they called him too sensitive, said he needed to toughen up, and suggested that you and the Princess of Wales were raising him improperly by focusing on emotional intelligence and feelings. The anger in William's expression intensified with each detail James provided. As a father, William was fiercely protective of his children, and as someone who had experienced the pressures of royal life firsthand, he understood exactly how damaging this kind of criticism could be to a child's developing sense of self. Do you know who these people were? William asked, his voice carefully controlled but clearly furious. James hesitated for only a moment before responding. Based on Prince George's description of the voices he recognized and my own observations today, I believe the conversation took place among Queen Camilla and several members of her social circle, including Lady Margaret Thornfield. William closed his eyes and took several deep breaths, clearly working to maintain his composure. James could see the internal struggle as William processed the fact that his stepmother and her friends had, intentionally or not, emotionally wounded his son with their thoughtless words. How is George handling this? William asked after a few moments. He's resilient, sir, and our conversation yesterday helped him gain some perspective on the situation, James replied. However, I'm concerned that this may not be an isolated incident. From what I observed today, these attitudes about child rearing and royal preparation appear to be ongoing topics of conversation among this particular group. William stood up and began pacing around the room, clearly agitated. So you're telling me that my stepmother and her friends are sitting around criticizing how Catherine and I are raising our children, and they're doing it loudly enough that George can overhear them. I'm afraid that appears to be the case, Your Highness, James confirmed. And based on some comments I overheard today, there may be discussions about taking a more active role in what they see as the children's proper royal education. This last piece of information stopped William's pacing abruptly. He turned to face James with an expression that was equal parts shock and outrage. Are you telling me they're planning to interfere with my children's upbringing? I can't say definitively what their intentions are, sir, James replied carefully. But I felt it was important that you be aware of these conversations so that you can take whatever protective measures you feel are appropriate. William returned to his chair, his mind clearly working through the implications of what James had told him. After several minutes of silence, he looked up at the sergeant major with an expression of gratitude and determination. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, James, he said, dropping the formal address in a moment of genuine appreciation. I know this puts you in a difficult position professionally, and I want you to know that I appreciate your willingness to prioritize my children's well-being. James nodded acknowledgement. Protecting your family is my job, sir, and that protection extends beyond physical safety. These children deserve to grow up feeling confident in their own worth and capabilities, not questioning themselves because of thoughtless adult criticism. I completely agree, William said firmly, and I intend to make sure that my children are better protected from this kind of emotional harm in the future. Camilla and I are going to have a very serious conversation about boundaries and appropriate behavior around my children. As their meeting concluded, James felt a sense of relief that the situation was now in William's capable hands. The protective measures that needed to be put in place were beyond James's authority to implement, but he had confidence that William would handle the situation appropriately. More importantly, George would know that his father was aware of his struggles and was taking steps to address them. However, James knew that his own role in protecting George was far from over. In the days to come, he would need to be even more vigilant about monitoring the boy's emotional state and ensuring that he felt supported and valued. The damage done by careless words could take time to heal completely, and James was committed to being part of George's support system throughout that healing process. The next morning brought an unusual tension to the palace that seemed to hover in the air like an approaching storm. Prince William had spent most of the previous evening planning his approach to the conversation he knew he needed to have with Queen Camilla, and by dawn, he had resolved to address the situation directly and immediately. The protective fury he felt as a father had crystallized into a calm, determined resolve that left no room for diplomatic niceties or royal protocol. James watched from his usual position as William made his way through the palace corridors with purposeful strides. The prince's jaw was set in a way that James recognized from their military days together, and his entire demeanor suggested that he was preparing for a battle that he fully intended to win. James felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that George would have his father's full support in dealing with the emotional aftermath of what had happened. Meanwhile, Prince George himself was slowly beginning to recover from the previous day's revelations. The conversation with James had helped him understand that the criticism he had overheard said more about the people expressing it than it did about him. But children process emotional wounds differently than adults. George found himself replaying the overheard conversation in his mind, analyzing each word, and wondering if there might have been some truth hidden in the harsh judgments. As George made his way to breakfast that morning, he was surprised to find his father waiting for him in the family dining room. William was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a gentle smile that immediately put George at ease. The prince had deliberately arrived early, wanting to catch his son before the day's activities began, and the palace filled with its usual bustle of staff and visitors. "Good morning, George," William said warmly as his son entered the room. "I was hoping we could have breakfast together this morning. Just the two of us." George smiled, genuinely pleased by this unexpected treat. Time alone with his father was precious, given William's busy schedule and numerous royal obligations. "That sounds wonderful, Papa. Is everything all right?" William watched his son carefully as George settled into his chair and began serving himself from the selection of breakfast items laid out on the sideboard. Even after James's conversation with the boy, William could still see traces of the uncertainty and self-doubt that had been planted by the thoughtless comments he had overheard. "Everything is fine," William assured him, "but I wanted to talk with you about something important. Sergeant Major Harrison mentioned that you seemed troubled yesterday, and he was concerned about you. He told me that someone had said some unkind things that made you question yourself." George's shoulders tensed slightly, and he looked down at his plate instead of meeting his father's eyes. "He told you about that?" "He did, and I'm very glad he did," William replied gently. "George, look at me, please." When George raised his eyes to meet his father's gaze, William was struck by how young and vulnerable his son looked in that moment. Despite George's growing maturity and natural confidence, he was still very much a child who needed protection and guidance from the adults in his life. "I want you to understand something very important," William continued. "The people who made those comments about you being too sensitive or needing to toughen up don't understand what real leadership looks like in today's world. They're operating from old ideas about what it means to be strong, ideas that frankly went out of style decades ago." George listened intently as his father spoke, hanging on every word. The validation from someone he respected and loved as much as his father carried tremendous weight, helping to counter the damage done by the previous evening's overheard criticism. "Your sensitivity isn't a weakness, George," William said firmly. "It's one of your greatest strengths. The ability to understand and care about other people's feelings, to consider how your actions might affect others, to show empathy and compassion. These are the qualities that make great leaders. They're the qualities that will make you a great king someday." George felt tears prick at his eyes, not from sadness this time, but from relief and gratitude. "But they said I was being coddled, that all this focus on feelings and emotional intelligence was wrong for someone in my position." William's jaw tightened slightly as he heard his son repeat the hurtful words, but he kept his voice calm and reassuring. "George, your mother and I are raising you to be exactly the kind of leader this country needs. We want you to be strong, yes, but we want you to understand that true strength comes from caring about people, not from shutting off your emotions or becoming hard and unfeeling." As they continued their breakfast conversation, William shared stories from his own childhood and young adulthood, times when he had been criticized for showing emotion or caring too deeply about others' welfare. He talked about how these criticisms had sometimes made him doubt himself, but how he had eventually learned that the people offering such criticism often had their own issues with emotional expression and connection. "The best leaders I've ever known," William told his son, "have been people who could feel deeply and still make difficult decisions when necessary. They weren't cold or unfeeling. They were people who cared so much about doing the right thing that they were willing to accept personal pain in order to serve others well." George absorbed his father's words like a sponge, soaking up water. The conversation was healing something that had been wounded in him, restoring his confidence in his own character and worth. By the time they finished breakfast, George was sitting straighter in his chair, and the shadows had lifted from his eyes. "Papa," George said as they prepared to leave the dining room, "thank you for talking with me about this. I was starting to wonder if maybe I wasn't cut out for being king because I care so much about people's feelings." William stopped and placed his hands on his son's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes with an intensity that conveyed the absolute sincerity of his words. "George, the fact that you care so much about people's feelings is exactly why you're going to be an extraordinary king. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." While this healing conversation was taking place between father and son, James was observing the palace dynamics with heightened attention. He had noticed increased activity around Queen Camilla's apartments, with several staff members coming and going with what appeared to be messages and documents. James's experienced, "I recognized the signs of someone preparing for an important meeting or conversation," and he suspected that William had wasted no time in arranging the confrontation that James's revelations had made necessary. Around mid-morning, James's suspicions were confirmed when he observed William making his way toward Camilla's private receiving room with the determined stride of someone who had unpleasant business to conduct. James positioned himself discreetly in the hallway, not close enough to overhear the conversation, but near enough to be available if his services were needed for any reason. The meeting between William and Camilla lasted for over an hour, and while James couldn't hear the specific words being exchanged, the tone of the conversation was clear even through the closed doors. William's voice was controlled but firm, with the unmistakable authority of someone who would not be contradicted or dismissed. Camilla's responses were initially defensive, then increasingly subdued as the conversation continued. When William finally emerged from the meeting, his expression was grim but satisfied. He had accomplished what he set out to do, and James could see that the prince felt confident that the message had been delivered clearly and unambiguously. William nodded briefly to James as he passed, a small gesture that conveyed mutual understanding and shared commitment to protecting George's well-being. Later that afternoon, James noticed significant changes in the behavior of Camilla's social circle. Lady Margaret Thornfield, who had been scheduled to join the queen consort for another tea gathering, arrived at the palace looking distinctly uncomfortable and left after less than 30 minutes. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell and Countess Victoria Pembroke, who had been regular fixtures in Camilla's drawing room, were notably absent from their usual afternoon appearance. The message had clearly been delivered not just to Camilla, but to her entire circle of friends. Whatever William had said in his meeting with his stepmother had been effective enough to change the group's behavior immediately and dramatically. James felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that George would no longer have to worry about overhearing disparaging comments about his character or his parents' child-rearing methods. As the day progressed, James made a point of checking on George's mood and demeanor. The transformation was remarkable. The boy who had been walking with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes just 2 days earlier was now moving through the palace with his usual confident bearing. The conversation with his father had clearly restored George's faith in himself and his future capabilities. During the afternoon, James encountered George in the palace library, where the young prince was reading a biography of Winston Churchill for a school project. George looked up with a bright smile when he saw James approaching, a smile that reached his eyes in a way that had been absent since the incident with Camilla's friends. "Good afternoon, Your Highness," James said warmly. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better, thank you," George replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Papa and I had a wonderful talk at breakfast this morning. He helped me understand that caring about people's feelings isn't a weakness at all. He said it's one of the most important qualities a leader can have." James nodded approvingly. "Your father is absolutely right about that, Prince George. Some of the strongest people I've ever known have been those who were brave enough to care deeply about others, even when that caring made their own lives more difficult." George marked his place in the Churchill biography and looked up at James with curiosity. "Sergeant Major Harrison, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Highness." "When you were a soldier, did anyone ever tell you that caring about your fellow soldiers was a weakness?" James considered the question carefully, recognizing that his answer could have lasting impact on George's understanding of leadership and strength. "Yes, actually, some people did suggest that I was too emotionally invested in the welfare of the men and women under my command. They thought I should maintain more distance, be less concerned with their personal struggles and challenges." "What did you do when they said that?" George asked. "I ignored them," James said simply, "because I knew that the soldiers who served with me performed better, fought more bravely, and looked out for each other more effectively precisely because they knew I genuinely cared about their well-being. Caring about people doesn't make you weak. It makes the people around you stronger." This conversation further reinforced the lessons George had learned from his father earlier that morning. By the end of the day, the young prince had not only recovered from the emotional wounds inflicted by Camilla's friends, but had gained a deeper understanding of his own character and the kind of leader he wanted to become. That evening, as James completed his final rounds of the palace, he reflected on the events of the past few days. A situation that could have caused lasting damage to a child's self-confidence had been addressed quickly and effectively through a combination of caring support, honest communication, and appropriate protective measures. George was safe, both physically and emotionally, and the adults responsible for his well-being had demonstrated their commitment to his healthy development. James felt proud of the role he had played in resolving the crisis, but more than that, he felt hopeful about the future. George was growing up to be exactly the kind of person the country needed as a leader, someone who combined strength with compassion, authority with empathy, and confidence with genuine care for others. The thoughtless criticism of a few misguided adults hadn't derailed that development. If anything, it had provided an opportunity for George to gain an even deeper understanding of his own values and character. As he settled into his quarters for the night, James made a mental note to continue monitoring George's emotional well-being in the days and weeks to come. While the immediate crisis had been resolved, James understood that protecting the young prince would require ongoing vigilance and support. But for tonight, at least, all was well in the palace, and George was safe from both physical and emotional harm. 3 weeks had passed since the incident that had left Prince George questioning his own character and suitability for his future role. In that time, the young prince had not only recovered from the emotional wounds inflicted by the thoughtless comments he had overheard, but he had emerged from the experience with a stronger sense of self and a deeper understanding of the kind of leader he wanted to become. The support he had received from both Sergeant Major James Harrison and his father, Prince William, had transformed what could have been a lasting trauma into a valuable learning experience. James continued to observe George with a watchful eye of someone who understood that emotional healing was often a gradual process rather than an immediate transformation. However, everything he saw confirmed that George was not only back to his normal confident self, but had actually grown from the experience. The boy moved through the palace with renewed purpose, engaged more thoughtfully in his studies, and seemed to approach his royal duties with a maturity that was remarkable for his age. The changes in the palace dynamics were equally notable. Queen Camilla's social gatherings had become significantly smaller and more subdued affairs. Lady Margaret Thornfield had not returned to the palace since her brief and uncomfortable visit following William's intervention, and the other women who had participated in the harmful conversation had largely disappeared from Camilla's regular social circle. When Camilla did entertain guests now, their conversations focused on art, literature, and charitable endeavors rather than criticism of the younger generation's parenting methods or speculations about the royal children's character development. Prince William had made it clear to his stepmother that any future comments about his children's upbringing or character would result in immediate and permanent restrictions on her access to them. While this had initially created some tension within the family, Camilla had ultimately seemed to accept that her previous behavior had been inappropriate and had agreed to maintain appropriate boundaries going forward. On this particular morning, James was making his usual rounds when he encountered George in the palace courtyard, where the young prince was engaged in an animated conversation with his younger sister, Princess Charlotte. The siblings were discussing a school project about historical leaders, and James couldn't help but smile as he listened to George's passionate defense of leaders who had shown compassion and emotional intelligence rather than ruling through fear or intimidation. But George, Charlotte was saying, my teacher said that some of the strongest kings were the ones who never showed weakness or emotion. George shook his head firmly, his voice carrying a confidence and conviction that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. That's not what real strength looks like, Charlotte. Papa explained it to me, and Sergeant Major Harrison has told me stories about the best military leaders he served under. The strongest people are the ones who care about others and aren't afraid to show it. James approached the children with a warm smile, pleased to see how thoroughly George had internalized the lessons he had learned from his recent difficult experience. Good morning, Your Highnesses. I couldn't help but overhear your discussion about leadership. It sounds like you're having a very thoughtful conversation. Charlotte looked up at James with curiosity. Sergeant Major Harrison, George says that caring about people's feelings makes you a stronger leader, not a weaker one. Is that really true? James nodded seriously, recognizing that this was an opportunity to reinforce the valuable lessons George had learned while also helping Charlotte develop her own understanding of effective leadership. It's absolutely true, Your Highness. Some of the most effective leaders in history have been people who understood that their strength came from their ability to inspire and care for others, not from their ability to intimidate or control them. Can you give us an example? George asked eagerly, clearly hungry for more stories that confirmed his newfound understanding of leadership. James thought for a moment, then settled into the storytelling mode that the children always enjoyed. Well, there was a military commander I served under in Afghanistan named General Patricia Morrison. She was one of the most respected leaders in the entire theater of operations, and she was known for her incredible tactical skill and strategic thinking. The children listened intently as James continued. But what made General Morrison truly exceptional wasn't just her military expertise. It was the way she cared for every single person under her command. She knew the names of hundreds of soldiers, remembered details about their families, and always considered the human cost of every decision she made. Did other people think she was weak because she cared so much? Charlotte asked. Some people initially questioned her approach, James admitted. There were a few old-school military leaders who thought she was too emotionally invested in her troops. But you know what happened? Her units had the highest morale, the best performance records, and the lowest casualty rates in the entire region. Her soldiers would have followed her anywhere because they knew she genuinely valued their lives and well-being. George's eyes lit up with understanding. So her caring made her troops stronger and more effective, not weaker. Exactly right, Your Highness, James confirmed. True leadership isn't about making people fear you or proving how tough you are. It's about inspiring people to be their best selves and helping them believe in themselves and their mission. As the conversation continued, James was struck by how much George had grown since their conversation in the garden 3 weeks earlier. The boy who had been devastated by criticism about his sensitivity was now confidently articulating why empathy and emotional intelligence were essential leadership qualities. More importantly, he was sharing these insights with his younger sister, helping to ensure that she too would grow up with a healthy understanding of strength and leadership. Later that morning, James received an unexpected summons to Prince William's private office. As he made his way through the palace corridors, James wondered what might have prompted this meeting. His regular security briefings with William were typically scheduled for the end of the week, and there had been no security incidents or concerns that would require immediate attention. When James entered the office, he found William standing by the window overlooking the palace gardens, where George and Charlotte could be seen continuing their animated discussion about leadership and history. William turned as James entered, and his expression was one of gratitude and warmth rather than concern or urgency. "Thank you for coming, James," William said, gesturing for the sergeant major to take a seat. "I wanted to speak with you about the situation we dealt with a few weeks ago, and to thank you properly for your role in protecting George." James settled into the offered chair, feeling slightly uncomfortable with the formal gratitude. In his mind, he had simply done his job, nothing more and nothing less. "Your Highness, I was just doing what anyone in my position would have done. Prince George's well-being is my responsibility." William shook his head, moving to sit across from James with an expression that conveyed deep sincerity. "No, James, what you did went far beyond your professional responsibilities. You could have simply noted that George seemed upset and left it at that. Instead, you took the time to understand what was troubling him, provided him with the emotional support he needed, and then made sure that the information reached the people who could address the underlying problem." James listened quietly as William continued. "Catherine and I have been watching George these past few weeks, and the transformation has been remarkable. Not only has he recovered from what happened, but he seems to have gained real confidence in his own values and character. That's largely due to the conversation you had with him in the garden that day." "Prince George is a remarkable young man, Your Highness," James replied. "He has natural wisdom and empathy that will serve him well throughout his life. I just helped him see that what others viewed as weaknesses were actually his greatest strengths." William nodded approvingly. "And that's exactly the kind of guidance he needed. James, I want you to know that Catherine and I consider you much more than just George's bodyguard. You're one of his most important mentors and sources of support. The relationship you've built with him over the years has been invaluable." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with William expressing his appreciation for James's dedication not just to the family's physical safety, but to their emotional well-being as well. As they talked, both men reflected on how the recent crisis had ultimately strengthened George's character and deepened the bonds of trust and communication within the family. "There is one more thing I wanted to discuss with you," William said as their meeting drew toward a close. "Catherine and I have been thinking about George's education and preparation for his future role. We want to make sure he continues to receive guidance from adults who understand and share our values about leadership and character development." James waited attentively, sensing that William was leading up to a specific proposal or request. "We were wondering if you would be willing to take on a more formal role in George's education," William continued. "Not replacing his current tutors or academic instruction, but serving as a mentor specifically focused on leadership, character development, and understanding what it means to serve others. We believe your military experience, combined with your understanding of George's personality and needs, makes you uniquely qualified for this role." James was genuinely surprised by this proposal. While he had always felt a special connection with George and had naturally found himself serving as a mentor figure, the idea of formalizing this role had never occurred to him. The responsibility was both humbling and deeply meaningful. "Your Highness," James said carefully, "it would be an honor to serve Prince George in this capacity. I believe strongly in the kind of leader he has the potential to become, and I would be privileged to play a larger role in helping him develop those capabilities. William's face broke into a satisfied smile. Excellent. Catherine will be delighted to hear that you've accepted. We'll work out the specific details over the coming weeks, but the important thing is that George will continue to have access to your wisdom and guidance as he grows up. As James left William's office, he felt a profound sense of purpose and responsibility. The crisis that had brought George's emotional needs into sharp focus had ultimately created an opportunity for James to serve the young prince in an even more meaningful way. He thought about the conversation he had witnessed that morning between George and Charlotte, where George had confidently shared the lessons he had learned about true strength and effective leadership. That afternoon, James found George in the library again, this time working on a different school project about modern democratic leadership. The young prince looked up with a bright smile when James approached, clearly pleased to see his mentor and protector. "Sergeant Major Harrison," George said enthusiastically, "I'm writing an essay about what makes a good leader in today's world. Would you mind if I quoted some of the things you've taught me about caring for the people you're responsible for?" James smiled warmly, moved by the fact that their conversations had made such a lasting impression on the young prince. "I would be honored to be quoted in your essay, Your Highness. What specific ideas did you want to include?" George consulted his notes before responding. "Well, I wanted to write about how real strength comes from understanding and caring about other people, not from shutting off your emotions or being mean to people. And I wanted to explain how the best leaders are the ones who inspire others to be their best selves rather than making them afraid." As James listened to George articulate these concepts, he was struck by how thoroughly the young prince had integrated these lessons into his own understanding of leadership and character. The boy who had been wounded by criticism about his sensitivity was now confidently advocating for empathy and emotional intelligence as essential leadership qualities. "Those are excellent points for your essay," James said approvingly. "You might also want to mention that true leaders are willing to make difficult decisions when necessary, but they always consider the impact of those decisions on the people they serve." George nodded eagerly, making notes as James spoke. "That's a really good point. It's not that caring leaders are weak or indecisive. It's that they make sure their decisions are based on what's best for everyone, not just what's easiest or most convenient for themselves." Their conversation continued for another hour, with James serving not just as a source of quotes for George's essay, but as a sounding board for the young prince's developing ideas about leadership, service, and character. By the time they finished, George had outlined an essay that demonstrated remarkable maturity and insight for someone his age. As James walked back to his quarters that evening, he reflected on how much had changed in just 3 weeks. A crisis that could have permanently damaged George's self-confidence had instead become the foundation for deeper wisdom and stronger character. The young prince was now more secure in his own values, more confident in his ability to lead effectively, and more determined than ever to become the kind of king who would serve his people with both strength and compassion. James felt proud of the role he had played in this transformation, but more than that, he felt hopeful about the future. George was growing up to be exactly the kind of leader the world needed, someone who understood that true power came from serving others, that real strength was demonstrated through caring and empathy, and that the most effective leaders were those who inspired others to be their best selves. The incident with Camilla's social circle had been painful and unnecessary, but ultimately it had provided George with valuable lessons about his own character and the kind of leader he wanted to become. With the continued support of his parents and mentors like James, George was well on his way to becoming not just a good king, but a great one. And James would be there every step of the way, protecting not just George's physical safety, but his emotional well-being and his growing understanding of what it truly meant to lead with both strength and compassion.